Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher. After I came back home from my vacation, I completely forgot how to make all these videos and stuff, which also coincidentally happened sometime after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Anyways, before we start with this particular video, let me make a little correction, let's say. In one of my probably most important videos about what is called the nature of knowledge on this channel, I've made a mistake, I would say, a tautology that sounded like, well, in my definition of knowledge, or actually the world, I made a sort of a vicious circle. So I say like, the world is a set of stories that we tell each other about the world. So it ends up being like the world is blah 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 about the world, which doesn't sound very healthy, you know. So that was a mistake caused by my own inconfidence, let's say, because, well, like, it was just caused by me speaking, let's say. I wouldn't make that mistake writing, right? So I just felt like something needs to be added because I wasn't confident enough that what I said was enough. So let me reclamate that, let me correct that mistake. So it should be read like, the world is a set of stories that we tell each other, period. No about the world part, right? So with that out of the way, this particular video is again me fulfilling my promise about making a video about the aliens. And in fact, as you might tell from the title of this video, which I haven't seen yet but you already seen, is about the aliens, right? So this is called The Onion of Aliens Part 1, I hope, at least. Okay, so there's gonna be Part 2 and Part 3 sometime down the line, in probably 1 week and 2 weeks from now or about, so we'll see. So this is Part 1. This is mostly like an introduction to the whole problematic of aliens. And why talk about aliens in the first place? Well, I believe that the problem of aliens, the extraterrestrial intelligence or alien life or things like that, it's actually a cornerstone of philosophy in the first place because, well, whatever we find in terms of, again, alien life or alien intelligence, it would be a serious, you know, smack upside the head for any kind of speculative philosophy, because well, by finding the other, so to speak, the other life, the other intelligence, the other civilization, the other whatever, we're gonna better understand our own life, intelligence, and civilization, right? Which is, and culture, and etc., which like dealing with all those things is the main issue in philosophy, really. So the problem of aliens is like a knot where all of these problems kind of coincide together, and it's really important for any type of philosophy to deal with it somehow, I believe. So that's why I'm dealing with it, at least I'm trying to. Okay. And we'll do it in the next 50 or 60 minutes, I don't know. I hope 50 at least, but we'll see. So whenever we find any sort of alien, whatever, intelligence or life, we would sort of like whoosh through all these questions, like what is human life, human intelligence, etc. So in considering the alien whatever, I'm trying to really consider the human whatever, right? And in certain sense, I'm trying to kind of like tap the limits of what it is to be human, what it is to perceive the world as a human being, as an alive being from Earth, etc., etc. And I believe that the search of this sort of perfect alien, like something completely alien, exactly helps us to do that, to define what it means to be human, right? Where define actually, you know, it contains this root of finite. So definition means to set borders, make finite, okay? I hope that's pretty clear. So we're basically dealing with humanity, what it means to be human right here, when we're dealing with what it means to be alien or something like that. So I honestly wish that somebody else would do that rather than me, because it's a really complicated problem, and I'll touch on that later. But I don't believe that modern engineers, people like, you know, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whatever, entrepreneurs, and even modern scientists, people like Hawking, see my video about Hawking, or, I mean, Hawking is dead, obviously, but the people like him who are still alive, are able to deal with it, because they don't even, they're not even capable of dealing with regular philosophy, you know, let alone kind of transgressing its boundaries. So again, long story short, I believe it's a really important question for philosophy, and I would certainly like someone really intelligent and smart to be dealing with it, rather than, you know, those scientists and engineers and whatever. But, well, we have what we have, essentially. So I believe we need to, like, mobilize all the most vigorous and sanguine forces of humanity in order to deal with it, because it's at the very heart of all the philosophical problems. We need this, you know, devilish grin of a sophist, in the form of maybe, you know, Socrates' snout, if you look at portraits of Socrates, and we would definitely need something like a melodic laughter of Rossini, and cunning swing of his magpie tail, you know, something like that. After all, you know, devil lives on earth, actually, and we'll need the help of devil, you know, this cunning, devilish humor in some sense, to deal with the problem of aliens. And by the way, I think it would be a really good scenario, a really great plot for any sci-fi, whatever, or even sci-fi/fantasy kind of setting, to kind of embrace the idea that humanity aligns with the devil to fight off the aliens or something. I think it would be really cool, but maybe it's just me. Okay, so my plan for this video and the next two videos is to kind of draw a path from visible, so to speak, visible stuff about the aliens towards the invisible core that is so far hidden under this visible shell. And that's why I call it the onion of aliens, right? So I envision it all, this whole problem, as an onion that we can, theoretically at least, try to puncture, try to cut here and there, and remove those outer layers to go into the very core of this problem. And obviously, as we're going from this visible to invisible through all those layers, like simple scenarios become more and more obscure, and at the same time our eyes are gonna fill with tears, you know, as we lament our miserable fate, etc., etc. But okay, so let's start kind of 10 minutes into this video. So the first layer, the most obvious layer of this onion of aliens, is, we'll just consider this scenario. So like humanoid aliens attack Earth, and they, like, you know, capture the cities, they wreak havoc on the streets, they kind of process humans into biomass, etc., etc. So it's a very simple scenario that has like hundreds of variations in movies, in games, in what else? I don't know, maybe music, I don't know. So we're already familiar with that, right? It doesn't have any, it doesn't cause any resistance from our side, exactly because it has been explored so many times in fiction. So, and again, it's so easy that even like Hollywood producers can understand that. So it's really like rubbish level of intelligence, like, you know, on D&D terms, it's like 3 intelligence that is required to understand that. And here really all the antagonism between humans and aliens is in competition, just regular political struggle. So these humanoid aliens, they really could have been represented by just foreigners. You know, it just might have been another country invading our country, let's say, and doing all the same things. So there's no foothold for any philosophy here. It's all politics. It's all just whatever. So, in some sense, it allows for action to be initiated, you know, all these sci-fi action movies, but it doesn't have any philosophical significance. It's too dull, it's too bland, it's too shallow, let's say. So it's too trivial. So, okay, let's now try to cut this outer layer, the most visible and simple layer, and go inwards a little bit. And here I should make a comment, a general comment towards these 3 videos, is that I'm going to try to make these cuts like here and there, and kind of try to go inside from many sides simultaneously. So, of course, ultimately, like, the best scenario would be to depict all of that in sort of like in the form of a 3-dimensional graph, let's say, where we can kind of connect one idea to the other, ask questions from different sides simultaneously, right? But unfortunately, the form of the video essay or whatever it is that I'm doing right now is linear, so I cannot do it simultaneously. So I apologize in some sense that the next content might be perceived as very chaotic, at least from like the initial perspective. But hopefully, if you would watch it all, it would all kind of make some sense afterwards. Kind of reminds me how Schopenhauer, in his, you know, the world, der Welt als Wille, or die Welt, als Wille und Vorstellung, he actually asks the reader to read his book twice, because he says that every element kind of supports all the other elements. So at the initial reading, you wouldn't kind of understand the whole thing. So you need to read it the second time, already knowing what's in the end, and thus you would understand even the first points better. But I wouldn't ask you to do that. In fact, the average time of involvement of my viewer is about 6 minutes. So the absolute majority of you aren't even watching anymore this video. So anyways, okay, so I'll ask some questions to this first layer, and we'll try to proceed like slowly but surely, hopefully. What if these aliens, humanoid aliens, kind of go attack to obtain some resource which is abundant? So it's not like they're competing for our cities, for our women, I don't know, for whatever that we also need, but for some resource that we don't really need, like air or water, because, well, we can't even own it, you know, it's just too spread out. So, and I know at least one work of fiction that deals with that question, which is The Man Who Fell to Earth, you know, with David Bowie. But in this work of fiction, it's really, this conflict is really muffled. It's kind of blurred. And even the protagonist is not really alien. So you can say that there exists certainly a certain personal drama, certain personal alienation of this particular character, but there is no like fundamental alienness to him, right? There's just something wrong with him. So people just perceive him as a strange person, but not as like a genuine alien, right? But anyway, if you try to generalize that to some alien collective, let's say, then anyway, that type of invasion, let's say, wouldn't even bring any kind of conflict, any kind of real conflict, because, well, since we cannot even claim air or water, they're like infinitely abundant, then we cannot control it, and therefore we cannot do anything with it. So aliens might just either go and take it, or we would fight back and they wouldn't even go in and take it, right? So there isn't any subtle politics to it, you know, except for the scenario where they would have some, you know, planetary-wide vacuum cleaners that would suck all of our air or all of our water, which is, I guess, more or less, I think I saw that in this Independence Day 2 movie. I'm not sure about that. I kind of have a hard time remembering what's in it, but I guess there was something similar to this huge vacuum cleaner that kind of sucked the water out of oceans or something. I'm not sure. But anyway, so what if they would come for something even rarer, like some rare mineral? In this case, of course, we can, again, derive some politics, some wars, perhaps, between the resource companies that mine this mineral or sell it or whatever, or perhaps even humans need it, so there would be, again, a political game here, etc., etc. And it might not be appropriate, but somehow I remember Frank Herbert's Dune with regards to this scenario, but I don't know, I haven't thought about it much. But it's still boring on philosophical level, you know. It's still regular politics, more or less. Like, you can think of wars in 20th century for oil or natural gas, or you can think of wars in 19th century for coal and iron. Like, again, proverbial example is wars of France and Germany for Alsace and Lorraine, etc., etc. So that's how European Union started. By the way, it was the union of Germany and France for the, you know, controlling these areas that they've competed for like half a century before that, or even a whole century. So anyways, it's boring. That's the bottom line. It's not really philosophical. Anyways, so how do we make it more interesting? Like, let's try advancing to the next layer of the onion. What if they're not humanoids? I mean, these aliens. And we have a lot of examples of that, again, in fiction. And but the sort of like a, again, boring thing about all those examples is that they are all built on some analogs of non-humanoidness from Earth again. And of course, the first generalization from humans is animals. I'm sorry, and they have more or less humans in those types of sci-fi universes or whatever have the same more or less type of interaction with these aliens as with animals today. And this quote from Ashley Williams from Mass Effect comes to my mind, you know, I can't tell the aliens from the animals. So, again, it's still lazy and boring, right? Because mostly, like, in 99% of all cases of all these sci-fi universes, you have like basically whatever these alien civilizations are, they have more or less the same type of language, the same type of culture as humans do, right? And maybe with, you know, some minor accentuations, like but even like their biological form. Well, first of all, it's biological, so there's a huge similarity here, right? But there's even another layer of similarity where their biological form is taken from the animals from Earth. Like, they're like weird organisms, but kind of like birds, or weird organisms but kind of like fish, or weird organisms but kind of like insects, etc., etc. So it's a certain lack of fantasy is present here, definitely. And so you can see that the typical science fiction way of generating aliens, if you like, is to fix like all the parameters of human species, of human beings, and maybe vary one of them, or maybe a few of them at best. Like, for example, a very like for example, we might say that in some sci-fi universe you would have like an octopus, which is again taken from the earthly biological realm, and it has more or less the same civilization, but it kind of speaks in reverse, whatever that means. That's like a more or less typical creation taken from any, you know, any typical space opera, so to speak, or so-called rather. So we have this very ruminating, chewy way of doing things in sci-fi, which really bothers me on some level. And I should note here that if all of that really, if they weren't so lazy, I mean the writers of all that, all of that could have been achieved just by having one species, and all these differences could have been explained through just cultural differences, as for example people in Expanse do. Expanse, the TV series, which is freaking awesome. If you haven't seen it, I certainly recommend you to do it. It's like a Star Trek of our time. So there you have more or less only humans. Of course, there's a certain other thing in the background, but okay, I already told you that the spoilers don't really spoil your satisfaction from a fictional work. So there are aliens, but they're in the background, and all the things happen between humans, but with very different cultural backgrounds, let's say. So this is a really typical way of producing a typical space opera, where you have humans as basis, as sort of like a center of all of it, and then you have some accentuations of humans, let's say. So all these races are, one of the races is a little bit more aggressive, one of the races is a little bit more smart, the other one is a little bit more stupid, the fourth one is lives a little bit longer, etc., etc. So it's really boring. And yeah, so all right, let's try to go to the next level of this onion. Proceed a little bit inside. So if they're not, and I mean the aliens are not humanoids, and not even animals, and not even plants or bacteria or whatever, what are they? Are they still the agglomerations of cells, like all of our multicellular organisms are? Are they still, do these cells still have this organic, that is carbon-based polymer thing based on water with the addition of some minerals? Do they still have the genetic code that governs the expression of all that, the whole machinery behind that? Do they have all that? And if they do, essentially I would say it's still the same scenario, it's still just different people, and any kind of scenario you can play on that would just be political. It would just be more or less, you know, a bear would suddenly become sentient and would fight humans for whatever, right? It would be absolutely the same. And by the way, I'll mention a very similar scenario, I think in the third video, or maybe in the second one, we'll see. I think in the third. I'll talk about intelligence specifically in the third video, I think. But we'll see. So anyway, so they would be at best just different people or civilized animals. But here I wish to ask the question about civilization in the first place. Like, why would civilization exist actually in those aliens, whoever they are, and however they are realized biologically? Because if they are more or less animals, or certain analog of animals of ours, well, our animals don't have any civilizations, right? So why would those guys have it? And even humans on Earth, most of the time of their existence, didn't have any civilization, right? And so the question arises, what actually brings forth the things like, language, reason, consciousness, all of which seem to be connected neatly to the civilization? Now, in this video, I don't really plan to answer these questions, although again, in the third video, I'll definitely talk about consciousness and reason, at least for a little bit. But long story short, I would say that true aliens would not have the same type of civilization that we have, right? So this space opera scenario is just impossible, I think, at least. And I'll try to give a couple of arguments in support of this point. Like, for example, if you say that they would have the same type of civilization as ours, it would mean that it would be equivalent to saying that our civilization is the only civilization possible, which is not the case. And we know it empirically, because even humans on Earth have had different civilizations. There have been definitely, and there are still different types of civilizations, which is very baffling because, again, if you look at the biological side of things, most of the humans are like 99.9 and maybe a couple of nines after that % equivalent in genetic terms. So they're very similar. Yet, you can see all this diversity in cultural sense, right? So, yeah, it's a very problematic point. Like, why would a single civilization of human species, okay, I'll return to that point a bit later. I'll just mention here that, well, yeah, forget about that. Let's say that the same species or species of aliens, because we don't really know if the concept of species is applicable to aliens, because that depends on their biology or whatever else, their meat, however they are realized technically. The same species of aliens might have different civilizations. And I don't really remember a lot of cases in sci-fi where somebody would have explored this idea. But it's a very important idea, I believe. Like, if we see that humans have different civilizations, why don't we suppose that aliens would have different civilizations? Right? It seems very reasonable. I mean, again, the same species of aliens. The only case, perhaps, where such an attempt have been made, at least the only case I can remember clearly, is the Urquan, Korra, and Kazurza in Star Control universe, where they're like technically the same species, but they have different cultural inclinations, let's say, and maybe even their biology changes a little bit because of that. I don't really know the lore well enough, but anyways, there have been at least one attempt to explore that scenario, let's say. So it would be really stupid, I would say, really naive, to assume that again, what I've mentioned before, like reversely speaking, octopus would produce the same type of civilization as the proverbial white European male of the last 3 centuries, you know, the Western civilization that we have right now. Well, maybe not 3, maybe 5 centuries. So think about that a little bit. Like, we have Aborigines in Australia with completely different civilization. We have, well, you can probably come up with like a dozen examples yourself. So why would an octopus that speaks in reverse produce the same civilization as this small group of European people, and in this small, how do you say it, small period of time, going from now back? It seems not very plausible. That's my point. Okay, so it might fit for Hollywood, you know, but it's not philosophical. That's what I'm saying. And you can think of in general, the point of how much our culture and our civilization depends on our biology, really, and our physiology. You can think of like how much our environment, the way we design things, the way we produce things, the way we use things, and kind of orient around in the world depends on our physiology, right? Like, I'm sitting in this chair, it's because I have, you know, a certain part of my body that helps me to sit in this chair, and I have my back, etc. And the whole idea of sitting in the chair is caused by the fact that I'm getting tired of walking, right? Walking is hard for a human being. It's not something new, it's something that we've trained to do not so long ago, right? Etc., etc. So this chair, it has like multiple layers of culture behind it, culture and biology, even more layers of biology, right, etc. That, like, think of a human hand, like the proverbial, you know, thumb that we can use to make instruments, etc. Like, oh, I'm not sure who said that, like some of the evolutionary biologists, or maybe one of the Marxists, I don't know, who've emphasized the role of thumb in labor, in producing stuff, right? After all, you know, with your thumb, you can write text messages with one hand, which is, you know, it's very useful. So our civilization would definitely crumble without it. But anyway, so just think about it, like how our instruments are really just like shadows of our other anatomical representations, our organs. Again, think of the stick from 2001 Space Odyssey. Like, what is stick? It's basically an avatar of hand, of an arm, right? That you can hit something with, but stick is even better in some regard. So it's a better arm, right? It's stiff, it doesn't break, well, at least to some degree, and it doesn't hurt if you hit something with it. So it's a better arm for hitting specifically, right? Or think about a bowl or a plate. It's really a better hand for like holding stuff in it, right? Especially liquid stuff, for example, or even two hands, etc., etc. So much of our culture is predetermined by our biology and our physiology and our whatever. So to really think that an octopus would even have a concept of a ball or something like that, or even have a concept of storing food, if they say that they live in some liquid environments, etc., would be stupid, naive and stupid. So yeah. Okay, and really, culture depends on biology. This is my main point here. And culture itself is really a tool of improving life, a tool of ordering life, a tool of, you know, expelling chaos, if you like, kind of keeping chaos at bay, making some part of our environment livable, so to speak, habitable. and at the same time, it's a tool of coming to peace with finiteness of our own life. And here I remember the idea of Sergei Pereslegin, a modern Russian philosopher, who says that elves, you know, classic fantasy elves who live like 1,000 years or so, they wouldn't need any kind of high culture. You know, they're always depicted as these super wise, super calm, and super educated, etc. But he says that no, they wouldn't need all that, because again, if they lived that long, they wouldn't need any kind of religion or art to cope with their short longevity. And I mean, humans have short longevity compared to elves. So elves wouldn't have all that to cope with that, right? So they would really be probably, and I'm not sure Pereslegin told that, but I'm telling that, there would probably be brutal savages without any sort of decent culture the way we understand it, right? And the same comes to Asari in Mass Effect. And if they had the same libido, the same tempo of procreation, let's say, they would probably be in constant war with each other, because well, just imagine that they procreate, and all these elder elves, they don't die out, so they have a problem with very rapidly growing population, right? So in the situation of scarce resources, they would constantly wage war on each other, and thus they would survive, right, through killing each other. Though you might make a counter argument that we know of civilizations that did that, I mean, did produce a constant bloodshed, and that yet they've had pretty elevated cultures, such as, you know, these polis wars in antiquity. I don't mean like police, I mean polis as a like polity, like city-states, including Italy of Renaissance, etc. But anyways, if they had lower libido on the other hand, they wouldn't have this, you know, sublimation, this psychoanalytical concept that we sublimate our desires to make something creative, to make, again, religion, art, science, mythology, things like that. So again, they wouldn't have any kind of elevated high culture, whatever the heck that means, and most likely they would have a pretty low intelligence. Although there is an option if they had a higher intelligence, because they were constantly fighting, so they would, you know, kind of try to out-trick each other, so they would evolve very rapidly in the intellectual sense. That's also possible. But anyway, that way or another, I would say that the real elven society would probably more resemble some sort of Spartan oligarchy than, you know, some sort of New Age hippie society that we tend to depict them as. Although I've had some doubts on this point when I was thinking about it before I started recording this video, is that maybe, and this is a point where you can sort of attack my argument if you have enough effort to do that, that maybe we actually wage wars, I mean we humans, because we are fragile, because we are very short in terms of lifespan, because we're lacking resources, etc. So we are very miserable, but we want to transgress this miserableness through waging war. We're saying, no, we're not miserable, we're actually very strong. That's why we want to fight you. So this is this masochistic approach. If you watched my previous video, you know what I mean. A video about bad endings in fiction. So yeah, so maybe, I don't know, I just had this idea literally today. But that way or another, my point is that our culture is biologically predetermined. and just inductively generalizing, I would say that any culture is biologically predetermined, or not biologically, or whatever, you know, the mechanism are behind this type of life. So let's try to pierce another layer of this onion and ask the question, what is the internal buildup of the aliens anyways? So I would say that actually the elements themselves don't really matter, like whether it is carbon-based polymers or water or silicon or whatever the other alternatives, like methane or I don't know. Then you know, there's this idea of mirror life, like the same type of life as earthly life, but based on the left-sided sugars and right-sided amino acids, etc. It's a pretty interesting idea. But anyway, the thing is that in order to perceive life, we actually need to perceive it as alive, paradoxically, right? And I've heard a very interesting idea that we can actually feel compassion, we can identify with whatever reminds us ourselves. Like, for example, anything that keeps its form intact can incite compassion in us. Like literally a droplet of liquid that kind of escapes from a laboratory instrument, on some very deep level, it might incite compassion. You know, you can feel like, oh, like I don't want to ruin you, but I have to, I'm sorry, etc. So, or a tree, think about trees, like we know that they are alive from experience, right? We see them trying to repair their damage, we see them growing, etc. But it's not obvious from first sight, right? So it's not obvious for children, for example. But anyways, this is the idea, essentially. So, and in my video about gender, I think I mentioned that I think that the key characteristic of life is condensed in the genetic code, right? And the genetic code is exactly that thing that is responsible for keeping the form, this kind of self-care in some sense, like the preservance, etc. So, and the rest is all very secondary, like the cells, the tissues that cells form, like the organs that tissues form, etc. Like these characteristics that, for example, Herbert Spencer in his book First Principles have listed, these differentiation and ordering, this kind of growing of tissues from cells through their differentiation and ordering of tissues, etc., etc. And all the other characteristics of life, like social characteristics, follow from all that. But it's all very by these secondary characteristics. I mean, domination, struggle for resources, all the social interactions, like how Nietzsche put it, like wherever I found a living thing, there found I will to power, right? So this will to power, the desire to expand, to take up as much space as possible, to conquer stuff, to gather resources. It all follows from this basic seed of genetic code, so to speak. And really the regime of self-preservation, you know, at some point people thought that self-preservation is really the key, it's really the final goal. But Nietzsche says this is wrong, and I completely agree with him, is that the regime of self-preservation only kicks into action where the expansion would be too risky. So you kind of lie in that dormant mode for some time until you would find, you know, an easy way to expand somewhere else, basically. This is what self-preservation is all about. And so my point is that the key characteristic of life is this self-replication and self-repetition. And it seems to represent really a sharp limit of life itself. If you like, it's and human, what it means to be human, it also is a part of that larger tendency of earthly life in general. And I would say that science has actually recognized this. For example, in their, the need of life to self-repeat, if you like. So science has recognized it in the form of the principles of Le Chatelier, or auto-oscillations, the whole thing about synergetics, self-organizing systems, this bruxellator of Ilya Prigozhin, which is curious that Simon Schnoll, again a modern Russian biophysicist, he actually states that Prigozhin has stolen the idea of bruxellator from biophysicists from Pushkin in Russia. But anyways, I needed to mention that. So science has already recognized this. This is my point, that it's an inherent property of all living systems to sort of self-preserve, to have this equilibrium in some sense. But it seems to be a necessary condition for a system to be alive, but not sufficient, right? Because we know that a lot of inanimate systems also have this property, like just a regular pendulum has the same property, right? But anyway, so we need to add something to have a sufficient condition. And I would say that what we need to add, or at least what it seems to be that we need to add, is the more like complex self-replication, not just self-repetition, but like something else, which is the transfer of your genetic code or whatever into the new organism. So if, let's say, a vessels with Belousov-Zhabotinsky reactions could create other vessels and kind of infect them with the same reaction, we might say that they're alive pretty much. Of course, they're realized on some non-trivial basis, physical basis, but they're alive, more or less. They have all the properties of life. And I think that would be justified. And they would definitely need the external resources, right? The external energy and matter to create this vessel, to infuse it with their own type of behavior, etc. So here we would have the third property of life that Herbert Spencer mentions, and that is integration. I mean, the integration of resources, like gathering resources, right? So anyways, I would give, following all that, I would give my definition of life, more or less, which is that life is a process that repeats itself in time and in space. Okay, so this is my definition of life, at least a preliminary one. I'll make a correction like a few minutes later. And here, like, what exactly repeats itself in time and space doesn't matter. How exactly it does it also doesn't matter. It all would more or less be perceived by us even as alive, whatever it is, like physically. But the question might arise, well, how exactly it should repeat itself, right? And here, I think we can only give a tautological answer, really. The level of precision of this repetition should be such so that the repetition wouldn't stop, essentially. And if you kind of squint your eyes a little bit, if you think about it, you'll easily recognize here a very familiar Darwinian principle. Because what Darwin says is almost literally, it's very tautological, again, is almost literally that the whatever lives now was able to live from before. So basically, whatever wasn't whatever wasn't capable of living onwards did die out. That's what he says. But again, that's tautology, right? In the very definition of whatever is incapable of living lies the fact that it's gonna die, right? So whatever was capable of living did live on. So this is Darwinian theory in a nutshell. It's a tautology. But anyway, I believe it's a neat property of my definition that it also reproduces Darwinian theory inherently. And by the way, constructivists, for example, sort of emphasize this point that it's actually, Darwinism doesn't say that only like the fittest survives, so that the best survives. It actually says that all that could survive survives, right? So this is an important thing that not all recognize. I think it's important to recognize that. And we can look at some examples how it works. Like, for example, again, my definition, I mean, let's look at cancer cells. They are really cool, like they're really strong and they're really viable, but the problem with them is that they are really poor at reproducing, in the sense that repeating exactly, like their level of precision is very low. They just reproduce in whatever form they like. And that's why they're not viable. That's why they die eventually with the whole organism. So, yeah, so this is another example of how my definition works. So naively, you could say that cancer cells are cool, so they, from naive Darwinism perspective, you could say that cancer cells are very strong, so they should survive. Only they should survive. They would consume everything else. So we should have been like 100% of cancer cells. But this is not the case, because again, life is the repetition in time and space, and a repetition good enough for it to proceed. But in cancer cells, it's not good enough, basically. That's what I'm saying. But again, here I should note that when I say repeats itself, the process repeats itself in space, what I really mean is that it self-replicates, right? It's not just that in space we have the same things here and there. It's that those things actually self-replicate, like actively, right? So in this sense, I would probably use the word multiplication rather than repetition. So I would need to update my definition of life, and this would be the final version that I would propose, is that life is a process that repeats itself in time and multiplies itself in space. So this would be my final definition for life. Because otherwise, if you just say repeats itself in space, not multiplies, but repeats, you would come to a conclusion that elementary particles should be alive. Because, well, they kind of repeat in time. Yeah, they keep being equal to each other. I mean, equal to themselves as time goes on. And they are the same in space, right? 2 electrons are the same, at least we're assuming they are. 2 protons are the same, 2 molecules of hydrogen are the same, etc. So yeah, you would come to this very weird conclusion. And even more so, like electron and proton would even be like champions of universal evolution, because they can be found anywhere, literally anywhere. Of course you might ask, well, why not? We might think that they're alive, and well, really, why not? At some point, I think I have this idea kind of reserved for the third part, because I'm going to return to that issue. But in case I don't, I want to mention it here, that maybe, you know, this uncertainty principle about elementary particles is actually caused, it's a wild hypothesis that I've had, but who knows? Maybe it's actually caused by their free will, you know? We don't know where the particle exactly is and where it's going just because it has a free will. I mean, quantum mechanics doesn't contradict that. So there you go. You might ask your professor about that or whatever. Okay. Yeah. So we can take a look not only at elementary particles, we can take a look at stars, for example. There have been recently this lecture, like recently, a year ago, by Rupert Sheldrake about whether the sun is conscious or not. Pretty interesting stuff. Although he hasn't really said anything interesting, in my opinion. I mean, I already knew whatever he wanted to say. But like James Jeans, for example, had this idea that stars are liquid, the same idea promoted today by Pierre-Marie Robitaille, that, for example, the sun is liquid metallic hydrogen, that the stars are liquid and they might sort of undergo a certain, like, mitosis. They might divide, you know. Well, the mechanism that he proposed was that they rotate quickly and like just chunks of them kind of divide. So he used this mechanism to explain the prominence, the abundance of binary systems in the cosmos. But anyway, we know today, I mean, at least we have hypotheses in the electric universe, astrophysics, plasma universe, astrophysics, that stars and galaxies seem to actually form in these long plasma currents traversing the intergalactic space, etc., or interstellar space at least. So we might actually conclude from that they're alive. They're drawing energy from those plasma filaments. They're like gathering matter. We'll talk about entropy, by the way, a bit later. So they actually reduce their entropy, etc. So again, why not? Why not consider stars as being alive? I don't know. It's an interesting idea. But again, we'll talk about that a bit later in the second video, I think. Okay, so of course a skeptic, like from a back row somewhere, might have raised hand right now and like would agree and ask, well, wait a minute, like, Eugene, why the hell are you deriving, like, defining life through means of human, all too human, you know, in Nietzsche's terms, concepts of space and time, right? Because they're very human. Like, nobody guarantees that our concepts of space and time are true in the full sense of the word. And I would agree. It's actually a valid, justifiable objection. But the only thing I can say about that is that, well, I'm a human being, and hopefully you're a human being, so we perceive life through our human lenses, so to speak. And since we as humans have those concepts, and they seem to be more or less the basic ones of space and time, or at least the most general ones, well, then it's natural that we generalize the concept of life through the same concepts of space and time. But of course, I would agree that any other type of animal or intelligent being, whatever, fungus, it would perceive the world completely differently, and perhaps it wouldn't even have those concepts of space and time, or it would have some other concepts that vaguely resemble our space and time, etc., etc. Again, Poincaré have wrote quite profoundly about that, quite prolifically, I should have said, about how different conditions, different environments might bring very different concepts of space. If you're interested in that, you can read him. Okay, so I'm not even sure if, like, translation between those different perceptions of reality is possible. Like, if we could actually speak to one of those other beings, you know, can you explain to a bird how you perceive space? Well, in some regards you can, in some regards you can't. Like it really doesn't seem very coherent. It has some intersection, but not much really. But anyway, so it all boils down to the fact that our perceptions, our experiences, our culture, it's all predetermined by our biology. And even, like, if you like, you know, recursion, even the whole concept of our biology is predetermined this concept of our biology that we have is predetermined by our concepts by our cultural concepts, which are again predetermined by biology. So it's kind of this terrible nonlinear cultural mess, if you like. But anyway, let's get to other layer of onion. Maybe soon the video would disappear because I'm seeing that my camera doesn't have enough. I mean, the video has already been too long. Hopefully I'll finish it in like 5 minutes. We'll see. Probably not. But anyway, next layer of onion would be talking about sensory organs and perception of the world in general. We've already briefly touched on that. Well, I would more or less align with positivistic line of thought here, that only those things exist that we can perceive with our sensory organs. Our sensory organs are really the surface through which we interact with the world, right? So we would know aliens only as much as they interact with our sensory organs, and not more than that. So if aliens would not interact with us, with our sensory organs at all, we wouldn't know they are there. They wouldn't exist for us, okay? And of course, this same skeptic from the back row might say, well, wait a minute, there are plenty of objects in the world that we cannot perceive through our sensory organs. Like, a good example would be radio waves. Like, you can listen to radio wherever you like your Wi-Fi internet. It's not exactly radio, it's like more like microwave, but it still works, right? I mean, your phone can catch it, and you can even look at funny pictures due to it. So apparently it's something real, right? Well, it doesn't contradict at all to what I'm saying, because you still need some external tools to translate these radio waves or whatever into something that you can perceive. And if you didn't have those tools, if you didn't find that a piece of iron turns somehow magically, you wouldn't have the concept of magnetic field in the first place, right? It's only through the external agency, so to speak, of little piece of iron that you conclude that there is a magnetic field. But you can see the piece of iron, you can touch it, right, etc. You can have all sorts of perceptions about it. So only the piece of iron really contains the concept of magnetic field in some sense. It's like a doorway, like a bottleneck through which you can put your hand through and kind of feel the magnetic field, right? But otherwise, if piece of iron would react to magnetic field in such a way that would not provoke any of your senses, you wouldn't know it's there. It wouldn't exist for you. I mean, the magnetic field. So this is the idea. So that way or another, until something impacts your organs of perception, your sensory organs, it doesn't exist for you. All right? So this is the point. Again, well, okay, it's really getting too long. I should go to the ending soon. So we'd still need this translation in such a way that our sensory organs would be able to pick up whatever the signal is, right? Okay, and I think it opens up some possibilities again in sense of sci-fi. Like, we can invent like invisible, inaudible aliens, etc., etc., and that might be pretty interesting. I'm not sure if anyone has tried working with that. And we can even have a pretty interesting twist, like a plot twist, if the aliens would only be perceived by animals, for example. Because, again, we know animals have different sensory organs And plants have different sensory organs, and bacteria have different sensory organs, and fungi, I don't know, have different sensory organs, right? We know that bees and birds can sense the magnetic field, again, the one that I've already mentioned, etc. So why don't we assume that they can actually sense aliens somehow? That's an interesting idea. It's an interesting hypothesis, I would say. Maybe they already do. Like, you ever wondered what your cat is looking at, you know, when it suddenly wakes up in the night or something? That's an interesting idea. So, I believe we should, at least on the level of philosophy, try to distance ourselves from this anthropocentrism, so to speak, in sensory organ sense. So, after all, you know, we train some animals, we tame some animals, we teach animals to use tools, to, I don't know, sing or speak, like think of parrots. So, why aren't we sure, why don't we think that they also have something to teach us? You know, maybe they can perceive something that we cannot. Again, a very understandable example would be your dog or your cat kind of hearing something that you haven't heard, or kind of sniffing something. But again, we also have the same more or less sensory organs like hearing and odor, whatever the word for it. But maybe they have other sensory organs, which is a good idea, I believe. And maybe even humans have some, so to speak, non-assembled sensory organs, non-assembled so far. And by non-assembled, I mean not recognized as something singular, as some object, so to speak. Olfactory reception, I believe, was the thing that I forgot previously. But some other sensory organs or senses that might be present already, but we just don't recognize them. It's also, this idea has, I think, been researched, like at least on the level of fiction and fantasy. I can definitely name the game Dreamfall, where you have these shifters who can kind of sense and actually be in the other world, etc. But maybe, again, this is like a possible plot for some sci-fi, or just a mental exercise on philosophical level, thinking about aliens and alien stuff. Like, maybe we can actually, through some spiritual practices, like this training of these dormant senses or unrecognized senses, maybe we can actually perceive other worlds, so to speak, aliens, whatever. Now, of course, you might say, well, yeah, if you spend time with those kinds of spiritual practices, you know, certain branches of healthcare would take some interest in you, if you know what I mean. But again, I would ask a question like, why not? Like, I mean, it certainly is possible. I mean, I don't see any problems with such an idea that some extra sensory organs are possible, but we just don't recognize them, we don't know how to use them, and therefore we kind of miss all the information they're constantly feeding into us. I can see no problems here with this sort of idea. And a question connected to that is that why do we think there are only 4 interactions and, you know, 3 spatial dimensions? Like, so far, that has been enough for us to describe whatever we can see or feel in any type of way. But maybe there are more, maybe we just don't feel them. Again, of course, there's this positivistic idea, which I completely agree with, is that until it bothers us in some way, until it impacts us, at least in some way, until we can feel it, we can disregard it. But if we can feel it somehow, well, then we would have to take them into account. But so far, until they haven't impacted us in any way, shape, or form, we can neglect that, and I absolutely agree with that. So far, there haven't been any other dimensions or any other parallel universes or whatever. By the way, I'll talk about parallel universes in one of my videos about cosmology, which would be released, I don't know when, maybe in a couple of months. We'll see. I'm still not sure about my schedule. The next two videos are gonna be of this series of Onion of Aliens. So we might flood the fourth dimension and parallel universes with anything we like. It would only bother our fantasy until it's gonna impact us in some real way, our sensory organs. Alright, so an idea connected to that, to what I've previously said, is that maybe actually bacteria or other animals, plants, fungi, and whatever other organisms, maybe they already can feel the fifth interaction, whatever it is. And it's just that nobody paid attention to that. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, tried to put bacteria in particle colliders. Because, well, why would you do that? Scientists would say. Well, I'm as a philosopher, I've already put forth my argumentation. Why would you do that? Because why not? Because maybe they can feel something that we can't. You don't know. I mean, you're limited by your human perceptions. They have their own perceptions. So, who knows? Or, again, cats or birds, although that's more problematic from ethical perspective. All kinds of associations would attack you if you put a bird in a particle collider. I wouldn't say it's very cool also, but I mean, who knows? If that's gonna bring some important discovery, maybe that's worth it. Maybe that's worth it. So, or maybe they don't even need any particle colliders, because we only need particle colliders for high energy. Well, we also have high energy in cosmic rays, you know, so maybe just this ambient cosmic ray radiation would be enough for bacteria to feel anything, any fifth interaction or whatever, any other types of somethingness, or any other animal, etc. We just don't know how to translate their output from that perception, right? We just don't know what they're doing. Really, we cannot really communicate with them in any way. So maybe we should just pay attention or something. Or maybe even cosmic rays are not necessary. Maybe this whole interaction happens at much lower energies. Maybe it's everywhere, even without cosmic rays. Or maybe even the whole concept of energy of interaction is just only fitting to our interactions that we know about, but this fifth interaction or sixth or seventh or whatever, it works on a completely different principle that we don't even have a language to describe it with, you know. Maybe it's momentum and not energy. Maybe it's mass. Maybe it's whatever. Maybe it's some other concept that we don't even have yet. The possibilities are enormous. So I'm really baffled by the fact that nobody has thought about it before and nobody has integrated it into some decent sci-fi series or whatever. That would be pretty interesting. So, all right. Basically, yeah, I think we should stop right here because the video is probably not even working anymore. But okay, so we've talked about the Onion of Aliens, at least we've tried to. That was like the introductory first part. And there's gonna be a second and third part, more or less the same in size. So there's gonna be a lot of material coming on that topic in the near future. Like the next 2 weeks, I hope to finish that topic. So thank you for watching. The eons are closing.